Okay. So I'm talking about the JSON API standardization. It's linked in the lesson plan, and the idea is that we as developers are probably going to have some different first um, intentions about how we build our APIs and how we structure the format. Those are probably going to be different across human beings and developers across companies. So with this JSON API specification, it's kind of like, let's create a standard as we have with many other parts of web development and try to stick to it so that you don't have to think too much about, well, there's a lot of data here and I'm not sure exactly how I want to format this data. I'm not sure exactly what it will be most beneficial for my other users, which in the case of API development, generally other developers. And this specification will kind of allow us to kind of take some of that thinking out of it and go with their guide and go with something that has a lot. Some people have taken quite a bit of time to come up with. Cool. What else? Yeah, so I think like just to start, just to get us familiar, we're going to use Rails serializers today, and yeah, there's a couple of ways that we can format them. It's kind of like a new idea. Basically, what a serializer is going to do is instead, when we're doing API development, we don't have views, right? So a serializer is basically our object that we are going to use to customize the JSON output, and it will kind of serve as as you can think of it as like not synonymous, but kind of like the sister of a view. It's like an API kind of view, but we don't really have views with our API consumption. So we use serializers. And these serializers are highly customizable, and we're going to kind of like go through a couple ways that we can do that today. But yeah, I want to give you all a chance to like familiarize yourself with what is out there on Rails serializers. There's a blog post that I wanted to share that I thought was decent at like giving a high level overview. But if you're not into it, then what you can do is take like the next 10 minutes, just kind of like Google around, see what a Rails serializer does, what the point of it is, what is it. It's an object. It's a class that then becomes an object. Spoiler alert. But yeah, go ahead and read through and see if you can answer the high level questions at the top of the lesson plan in the warm up. And yeah, cool. Let's take 10 minutes on this. We'll come back together at 17. All right, let's come back together. I really appreciate and enjoy this shared doc system that y'all have come up with. Yeah, so I'll kind of open it up. Any information you found about serializers that you found helpful and want to share, or any questions you still have on like, yeah, but what actually is this thing?
It's usually language agnostic is one thing, so it's used with a whole lot of. It's just a process of turning an object into a JSON job is like, and then turning it back, but also limiting. Um, you don't necessarily want to display everything, so you can decide what attributes to show and or what attributes the front end gets access to. Is that kind of helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things I heard that I want to repeat back. It's kind of like a buffer, right, between your raw data and your model objects and JSON, right, and like actually like having a JSON object. And allows us to be customizable, right? Like we can decide within the serializer what we want to take from the data and then display as JSON and what we want to leave out. And yeah, this idea of a serializer is language agnostic, right? So we have them built into Rails, but higher level as like a programming concept. It's a way for us to kind of like take raw data and then present it in a way that is readable and consumable as JSON. Go ahead, Sydney. So you're not on mute, but I can't hear you. Okay.
Sorry, I have so many mutes. So I didn't get to finish the video I was watching, but it looks like you can like create a custom attribute in the serializer and then define how that attribute will render within that serializer, which I thought was pretty cool. Like it doesn't necessarily have to exist anywhere else. You're just saying like, hey, I want to have this attribute and this is what I want it to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great like example of something you can do. There's a few examples in the lesson plan, just kind of like doing a simple count as the custom attribute. But the idea is like, okay, like do it really comes down to like, do I want my model to like contain all of this logic, or can I put this in the serializer as a custom attribute and serve it up that way? And what are the trade-offs? What are the benefits of doing it one way or the other? But the idea of customizing an attribute right there in the serializer is available to you and is something that you can do as part of your design process. So love it. Cool. How about why? Why do we use a serializer? Anything coming to mind there?
Well, we need to turn our hashes into JavaScript object notation. So at the very least, we need to be able to convert that into the uniform format that everybody accepts, so we can send our information across the internet. At the very least.
Cool. Yep, absolutely. Sam, what do you have to add?
We could hand roll it ourselves, I'm pretty sure, and we could create our own serializer and just create our own like string of JavaScript objects, but it saves a lot of time to do so with a serializer that's made already.
Cool. Yeah, and where would you put that like hand rolled JSON if you didn't have a serializer?
I guess we'd make our own class.
Yeah. Cool. And that's a great like pattern, or thinking about that pattern. And where I guess what I'm getting at is like we don't want to, like it's the same idea of keeping our controllers light, right? Like we don't want to be doing this stuff in a controller, right? This is specifically API presentation logic, so we want it to have like kind of like you said, Sam, like a specific class for doing that presentation, to going from the data layer of our application to the controller layer of our application. And we want a specific buffer right there sitting in between to do this customization and hand it off in a pretty way. Our controller, that's not our controller's concern. Our model, nope, our model is concerned with storing data, updating data, reading data. It's not concerned with generating data in a JSON format for API consumption. That's not the model's job. So separation of concerns there. Cool. Yeah. I found like a couple of things for this why question that I'm just going to share in the chat. Or actually, yeah, Adam's typing in the doc. I'll put it in the doc right here. Maybe I'm screwing him up. All right, I'm not going to do the doc. I'm going to stop editing the doc. Sorry. That's for you all. I'll put it in the chat and let you transfer at will. So yeah, it's kind of like it's a couple things, right? Like separation of concerns. I already I already kind of like went over and creating a separate service class to do a specific job, right? And then we have the ability to refactor our code, and we're not quite there yet, but the idea there is keeping it dry. And then, yeah, within our serializer, right? Like generally the way that endpoints work is they're tied to a specific resource, right? Like we have an endpoint for a specific resource, or maybe a collection of a specific resource, and then our action is going to render all of them, one of them, based on the ID. Maybe it updates them. So our serializer kind of gives us a little bit more power since it's our API, and we might want to like say like, hey, yeah, you have a book resource here, but maybe you want to know what the author or authors is of that book resource, and we can generate that right in the serializer. And the good thing about that is now we can use one endpoint, one serializer, multiple resources within it, depending on what we need. It's really up to us. Cool. Anything else? Anything else y'all wanted to share? Resources that you're like, oh, this looks like it might be useful. I want to know more about this. Go ahead, Sydney.
I guess my question is like when you're doing these like custom serializers, or where you're like going in and you're actually making the data structure, just like I've just been noticing, like what is, for example, like what's in Postman is showing as like what's being tested is not necessarily what I'm seeing in my serial, like with the response from that, but it passes, which is, I'm just like, do you need all those little like type, and I guess there's like properties and all those like subsections, or is that something that's like just happening in the background? I guess I was getting a little confused around that.
So you're asking about like the tests that are built into Postman are passing, but you haven't quite set up, like customized it in the way that maybe like the JSON API 1.0 is asking for.
Correct. Yes.
Cool. Yeah, so I believe that the tests that are set up, that Ian has set up, like do not all look for the specific JSON API 1.0 structure, because of the whole idea is like, we're not having this lesson until a Tuesday. Y'all had all weekend to work on your project. We're not going to like give you a test that like tells you to do something that, well, I guess we have done that in the past, but
most of those tests do though look for the structure. Most of them are testing for the structure though.
Okay, so some sounds like some are not, is what I'm hearing. Cool. All right, so yeah, let's look at this structure. I'm gonna share real quick. I don't want to spend too much time here, just because this will be something for y'all to reference and look at kind of on your own as you're building out, the endpoints in the project. But yeah, let's click on this link here and just take a look. Okay, so specification, and like the whole idea, like they say it right here in this first sentence, it's like, hey, we would rather not argue anymore about how to structure this. Let's just come up with a formatted, let's just come up with a set of rules like we usually do in programming, so that everyone's not doing like their own kind of crazy thing. Cool. And here we have an example. This is from a blog that implements the JSON API, and it has, what does this remind you of from Mod 1? You're probably like, we didn't see something this crazy in Mod 1. I don't know what you're talking about. There's a term I'm looking for. I'm still looking for it. Maybe I should look in the chat. There it is. I knew y'all were in the chat. All right. Yeah. Nested collection is the term that I'm hoping for. Yeah. Nested you're like, oh, there's nested hashes. Correct. And there's also arrays as part of this structure. So it's a nested collection. And, it's going to be our job to create this nested collection in a way that corresponds to this format. And this is an example, and you're probably like, doesn't look like it's that easy because it's pretty complex. There's a lot of things. So if we click on view the specification, now it lays out all of the rules that we need to look for within our structure. All right. And so if I scroll down a little bit, client responsibilities, server responsibilities, this is mostly this is kind of like defining what headers we're going to need and what those headers need to say, because this is defining how like requests and responses should come in and be formatted based on the header. Content type is really the big thing to look at here, and it's a specific type of JSON. All right, and if we go down to our document structure, now it's kind of telling you like, hey, at the top level, we need at least one of these. All right, so we need either data to be a key there, we need errors to be a key, we need meta to be a key. Not all, we need one. All right, and then it tells you like, hey, if there is data, then errors cannot be present. If there are errors, then data cannot be present. All right, so we're kind of telling them, hey, based on your request, either you got some data, great, or you got some errors, but you can't really get both. All right, so those are some of the rules. Yeah, you may. I think something to look at here is the difference between may and must, because that's kind of how they lay out this documentation. You may have these other top level keys that are identifiers, or you may not. And the thing to think about though is we must have some things. All right, so we have some questions in the lesson plan here, like, hey, what's the root key? How are the attributes formatted for a resource and response? How are resources relationships formatted? And what I did when I came and was kind of like inspecting this, also full disclosure, I haven't like designed an API in quite a bit. So I think my process for digging into this stuff is going to be useful for y'all, because I kind of came in this weekend looking at this like, okay, I need to like refamiliarize myself with this stuff. And here's what I did. So I clicked on this JSON API link, right? And then I came here and I was like, okay, that looks like a hash to me. Let's go with that theory. And I went into my, I just started a pry session, so I'll redo it. And I was like, I need to find out some stuff about my data structure here. Let me hide this, grab that. And I was like, let me see if I can just paste it into pry and see if it works. Okay, great. It does. It looks like a hash was generated there on the fly. Now I have something that I can work with. Well, not really, because I didn't format it, but let's call it, just for the sake of keeping it simple, I'll make it response, paste it back in. Cool. Now I have a response local variable, and I can do some things now. I'm like, all right, this is such a nested data structure. I'm not sure where to start. Maybe I see what the top level keys are. Okay, now I have access to the top level keys, and I can be like, all right, let's see what my response data brings back. Still not that easy to read. Let's see what the class is. Oh, okay, it's an array. So now I can say, okay, I can treat response data like an array. And this is something that I want to encourage for y'all when you're kind of like digging into structures of large data sets and really nested collections. Get into pry, familiarize yourself with what's available to you. And yeah, and here's a great way that you can also be checking your responses, right? If you have like a custom, I mean, you have the test set from Postman, but realistically, you can be like, all right, let's see what's being generated from my API endpoint. Let's put it in a pry, and let's just make sure everything that should be there is there in terms of keys, types, yeah, and overall data. Yeah, so Adam, I'm not, so this is a great question. I'm not totally sure. I think so. I think that the root level key is data, or the root key is data, and the top level keys, at least for this response, it's like we have to remember if we have data, we don't have errors, and then I think the other thing that you can have is meta, and then the other stuff is optional, the other top level keys, but the root key that we need, it's either data or errors, and this one is data, or this one we have data. Ian, do you mind like just unmuting and kind of like going through this, because I'm not totally sure about the terminology.
So what I was adding in the chat is when we think of that data attribute, that's the top level attribute for everything else sort of nested underneath it. And so the idea of like the root key is like the very topmost key. But when we talk about like the top level key, that's like the sort of the key in front of like whatever's nested underneath it. So data is both a root key and a top level key. Data then is potentially a hash or like an array of hashes. And in that hash, you have like ID type and attributes. Attributes is then a top level key to everything that's packed under that. So when we think about items, attributes has name, description, unit price, created at, updated at, merchant ID, and all that stuff. So attributes is then a top level key for all those other things. And so as you nest deeper and deeper into these things, top level key kind of shifts down, but the root key is always going to be that data attribute at the top. But it does depend on like the data structure that you're dealing with. The way that we're building out the data structure here for the Rails engine project is going to be different from how other people build their API, and that's okay. There's a lot of different ways of building out this data, and every API you use is going to have some sort of different structure. As an industry, we're trying to conform to like, hey, we should all kind of do it this way. And the closest that we've come to is it should probably be JSON. But there are other ways of sending data other than JSON. There's XML. There's actually a binary version of JSON called BSON. We could just send it in CSV format. Like there's lots of ways that we could actually send that data, including HTML. But you know, kind of as an industry standard, like most APIs that you're going to deal with out there are going to be JSON based. And so then as a question of, well, how are you implementing your JSON? How am I going to implement my JSON? And you kind of all have to agree on these things. But when you build an API, you get to say, this is how I'm building my JSON. You conform to that or you don't use it. Like your user doesn't really have a choice. They have to use the data that you give them back. But if you change that structure, then that's a bad thing because now they're building their code expecting a JSON structure. So you can't really change it after the fact. And that's where we get into versioning, but that's going off topic.
Cool. Really appreciate that. Yeah. Cool. Let's take a break. We've been going for a little bit. Let's come back at 42 and we'll take some questions and then get into some you do section where you'll get to do some stuff with the serializers. Cool. 42. All right, it's 42. Let's come back together. Yeah, I wanted to like answer any questions if they're coming up. If not yet, that's okay. But I wanted to like just see if you have questions before we kind of like get into the coding part of the lesson. Okay, nothing yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some breakout rooms. That looks good. All right, let me just take a look at this exchange. Okay, so I've got you in breakout rooms, 3 apiece, and I want you to go through this part of the lesson on your own, and let me just show you what I'm talking about. Yeah, I want you to go through it on your own and set it up on your own, but then have like your kind of, you can think of like your teammates there to help if things go awry. Yeah, so down in this exercise header, there's some instructions. Now, you may have created a repository and coded along with the video, either Dion or Ian's. And if you've done that and you have a repo, you can build right onto that, and that's okay. And like if you're familiar with it and you want to do that, go ahead. If not, there's a building APIs repo that's kind of like a good baseline to get started from. And then there's some instructions here to get your repo set up kind of like from scratch. And then here, this Rails G model command, this is where you're going to start like generating like your model objects, which are going to generate it's going to generate a migration for you. And if you haven't used this syntax yet, take a look at what this command outputs. All right, take a look at it'll show you in the terminal like what it has created, and take a look at those files so that you're familiar with like what is this command doing if you're not familiar yet. And then I want y'all to get to the point where things are kind of like things are set up for you to start playing with the serializer. So you'll add relationships. Then this is a seeds file that's kind of like, you could kind of do what you want with this, but it's set up to create some books, create some stores, create some relationships between them, and then yeah, give you some data in the database for you to like look at when you're messing around with the serializers. And then yeah, we have to create the actions, we have to create the routes. So I want y'all to go through that. And then here is where I want y'all to get to basically. I want you to get to this point where you can like use Postman to check your endpoints and see what you have. And then once you're at that point, I don't know if I want to stop you. I'm going to basically bring us back together for any like questions on setup there after like probably like 25 minutes or so. And then the rest of class is going to be like trying to customize the output of the serializer. But I need y'all to kind of like all get to about the same place before that, and I'll help out as needed from that. But here, this customizing JSON point is the point I want you to get to in the 25 minutes. If you can go beyond that and start like, you know, trying to like build out this hash structure without using a gem, then go ahead, like if that's where you get to. But know that we're going to kind of like come back together and check in on what we did before that. Okay, questions on what I'm asking you to do? Okay, cool. I'm going to open these rooms and we'll take like 25 minutes. Feel free to ask for help if you need it. You can message me or use the ask for help button. Ian and I will probably be popping around. Cool.
Tim, can you?
We were supposed to get back like a whole JSON object.
Yeah, it kind of like,
Or like
if you tell
like
it
a
to.
blob.
So yeah, so you've got API v1 stores. Let's make this half the screen, and then let's pull up the controller on the other half. Cool.
That?
Yeah, can we hide the tree?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So if we hit this endpoint, What's our response? Our response, we don't have any data for it in API v1 stores when we hit it in Postman, but what is the, what's the status code? Because maybe that'll give us some info.
It's a 200, I think. No, 0204, no content. Okay.
Cool. So what does that tell you?
I'm guessing that it's like looking for a JSON object, but it's getting back these active record objects instead.
Yeah, and it's not sure how to render those, right? Okay, cool. So can you change this to where it will render correctly?
Would this just be like to JSON?
Let's give
I
it a
don't remember
shot.
what the exact. It did not work.
Okay, cool. So you're on the right track though. You basically want this to be rendered as JSON. So let's do a render and then JSON and then colon. Yeah, and then let's get rid of the to JSON because that's now redundant.
Okay, nice. I guess I just didn't get that far yet.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And that's like, this is kind of, it's not in the lesson until like further down that you're rendering it as JSON. But this is kind of like, yeah, you have these objects now. And now the next step, this is how you've been mostly building out APIs so far. And now the next step is like, okay, now I need to create this buffer, this serializer to customize the output.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'm gonna pop around unless y'all got any other questions.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. All right, looks like everyone's back. Let's take 5 and then I'm down to answer some questions as they come up. And then I kind of want to go through this hand-rolled version with you and show you how I would hand roll. And then, yeah, and then give you the rest of the time to keep working through the lesson plan. So let's come back at 22. All right, it's 22. So let's come back together. And I'm just kind of like showing what I've got currently in my controller and in my in my controller and in Postman. So let's take a look at this. Actually, sorry, I told you all I'd answer questions first. So let me pause and just see what's up with y'all. Anything come up while you're in breakout rooms that you want to discuss? Yeah, go ahead, Sandra.
Yeah, mine might be similar to Max's. We're in the same breakout room, but we were wondering if after you go through the manual one, if you could go through the fast JSON one, because it seems like a lot of people are doing it differently in the sense that they have the fast JSON gem, but are still manually creating the files and dropping things in there instead of like utilizing the gems functions. There just seems to be a lot of variety of what's going on or how it's working.
I see. Okay. So yeah, why don't we, I can do it. I can make my example, the one with the fast JSON API, because realistically, like there's a way to do this and customize it, but what we're going to implement is fast JSON API. So I'll do that example because it might be more helpful. Sam and Max, I saw you had hands up. Any follow-up?
It was just that.
Cool.
I was kind of wondering now, render JSON as a method that we call in the controller. It's not just creating like a preset view for us, right? It's doing more than just creating a view that we can see objects on. When we go to the URL, it's not just a view, right? It's a bit more than that.
Yeah, it's not a view. It's kind of like telling your application like what kind of content to render. Like, so you can kind of think of a lot of times when we don't define a render, it looks for HTML by default, right? And we'll like look to whatever the name of the view is that it expects, like show.html.erb or new.html.erb. And when we say render JSON, now we're changing that content type as a header to be JSON. And then under the hood, it's kind of like basically converting these objects to JSON, at least in the current setup right here. It's converting them to JSON, and then it's able to render these objects with their attributes as JSON. So yeah, there's definitely more than just like, you know, rendering a view going on. And I don't want you to necessarily think of this as a view. I want you to think of it as like a completely different response than you would with like an HTML view. Cool. Adam, go ahead.
Just quickly, just wondering, does render JSON store.all, does that do the same thing as just doing store.all.to_JSON? Like, would you have to require JSON for that?
So yeah, so I don't have to require JSON, and it doesn't quite do the same thing. So just converting it to JSON doesn't tell our application how to render it. So that's why doing this render JSON is actually necessary here, so that and render JSON kind of is twofold. You wouldn't need to have a .to JSON on the end of this, because under the hood, it's calling to JSON on the store objects. And it's also telling our application, like setting some headers in the response and telling our application like how to render the JSON. Yeah, cool. Good questions all around. Okay. So yeah, I want to do this fast JSON. So I'm going to start with like this fast JSON API. And here's what I think might have been throwing y'all off. So if I go to app, you all probably came in here and were like, hey, like serializers, let's create this folder. And then, you know, let's create a store serializer. That's great. And then if I come here, let me just make this an empty class so we can see what happens. Cool. And then let me stop this server, go to the gem file, add my API. I'm going to add it to all environments right now. I imagine that this we'll also need this to run in production. Bundle. Great, looks like we got that. And then let's run this command and see what happens. Okay, so I already have a store serializer here. It's empty, but it exists in this directory of serializers. And so now if I run my generate command, Rails G serializer store, and then give it the attributes. Let's see what the output is. Conflict. All right. So it's trying to do this by default, where it's basically like creating this new serializer in this serializers folder. So you got some options here. It looks like it's giving us a way that we could overwrite this, which is cool. So let's type H, because it types H for help. So I don't know. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with like kind of like command line tools, but I can tell it's telling me I can do H for help. And what I imagine H will do is show me what all these options here do. All right. And so there's like a Y and an N, an A, a Q, a D, and I don't know what they all do, but let's see. And then, yeah, indeed, this is what we get. I type in H and it's like, yes, overwrite, don't overwrite. all, overwrite this and all others. So if maybe I was giving it multiple serializer arguments to generate here, it'd be like, I could do an A and that's like, hey, whatever files are there, let's overwrite them. Cool. So it gives you some options here, which is nice. And then, yeah, maybe we show the diff. Cool. That's kind of nice too. If I look at the diff, I can see what it's going to try to do, like compared to my file currently. I can see what it's trying to add by default, which is nice. Ian, anything you want to say on this like process? Because like I feel like this is something we kind of gloss over in the lesson plan that they're running into that I just wanted to see. Nope, you're good. Cool. All right, cool. So I'm gonna just say yes, and I think I have to. It has to be. I don't know if it's a capital Y or not. It's capitalized here, but I don't know if that's just like
the capital. The capital means if you just hit enter, that's going to be the default one that it's going to do.
Interesting. Cool. So that's a good thing to know. Okay, so I'm gonna do a Y and see if this runs the way that I expect. Cool, it does. And now basically whatever was there, the fast JSON API kind of like just overrode it, created its own attributes based on the command that I ran, which was Rails G serializer, the name of the class that I want to serialize, or really the model. We can think of the serializer generally matching up with the model name. And then, yeah, what attributes I want to include. And these are all optional arguments that I can use to customize. Cool. All right. So now I need to actually use this serializer, right? And so the way that I would do that is I need to go into my controller, and why am I not using Command P? Don't ever do that. Yeah, and then I'm gonna say, right now I'm just rendering the raw data that's converted to JSON from this model, but I wanna use my serializer to do some work for me. So I'm going to say store serializer.new, and I'll pass it all of my store objects so that it will see this as, hey, this is a collection of objects here. And now it kind of like by default, it's going to go through and iterate on those active record objects and serialize each one of them. All right. So I've made some changes quite a bit. So let's test this out and see what's happening in Postman. Okay, let's go to my all stores request. Let's just make this full screen so we can see. All right, so my previous request before using the serializer included this created at and updated at. Let's see, what I would expect now is for it to only include the ID and the name. Cool, connection refused. I wonder why that is. I stopped my server, I imagine. I'm sure y'all are familiar with this error by now after working through the project. Cool. Okay. Quite a different response, right? So now by using this fast JSON API, it's done some of the formatting for me. It's created this root key of data, and then it's basically pointing at an array of every single store object that I had. But it's also doing some nice work under the hood where it's like, hey, I'm setting the ID and the type for you because that is part of that specification that I showed earlier. And it's setting the attributes as a nested hash based on the dynamic attributes for each store. Okay, and I've only got 5 in my database, so that's what it did. That is quite a lot of customization and not a lot of code, right? If we look at the, if we look here at our serializer, let's put it up next to it. Okay, so all I did, I included, I think that that's a module in there that I get from fast JSON API object serializer. And then I set the attributes and I passed in all my objects in my controller to do this. And what a beautiful output, right? Like I got the data formatted as an array. And so now it's adhering to that JSON API 1.0 standard. All right. Questions on any of this before I let you kind of like work on your own? And you know what I'll do? I'll show you the manual way that you would have to do this, which is a lot more code and a lot more difficult. But any questions on this fast JSON API or this process that I ran through? Go ahead, Max.
So just so I'm sure, so if you were doing this for the show, you would do the same kind of thing where you're rendering JSON store serializer.new, but instead of passing in store.all, you would just pass in store.create with the, or store.new with the ID.
So you would simply pass in this store object here. So instead of passing in all a collection, I'll pass in the one store object here. So this would be my argument, and I'll just write it out so you can see. Actually, I won't use what I already did. Cool. And this is one of the things I wasn't sure about, Max, when we were in the breakout room. But this is one of the things that the fast JSON API is able to do. It's able to like realize, do I have an object, an active record object? Do I have an active record collection of objects? Based on that, let's format it a certain way.
Right. Okay. And question on that, if you wanted slight formatting for your collection versus for a singular object, could you do that in the serializer class that you would customize what it?
Not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you, so you're saying like, what if I want a custom serialized object based on whether it's a collection of stores or whether it's a single store? And I'm not positive, to be honest. I'm not sure if you can set that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't know. I would say generally there shouldn't be necessarily a reason to customize based on single or collection, just based on the JSON API 1.0, like the formatting. But I mean, there's definitely a way to do it. Like you could probably check and see like, hey, is this like which method called me? Like which controller action called me as a store serializer? And if it's the show, you could be like, okay, here's some custom attributes. If it's the index, here are some others. There's always a way to do it. I'm not sure exactly how or why. Like I can't think of a use case where you would need to do it.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me show y'all how this would look if I wasn't using the fast JSON API. And there's a branch on this repo that y'all clone down so that you can see like what it looks like. It's called Complete Serializer Without Gem. And I'll just show you what the serializer looks like. So it's a class method here. And that's something you can do if you're not using the gem, right? To make it a little bit faster and not load up an instance and deal with the object garbage collection. But if you're going to use the gem, it needs to be, you're going to create a new instance of the serializer with the fast JSON API. But in this example, we're not using the fast JSON API. We're customizing it, right? Like we're just creating it. And what are we doing? Essentially creating a nested hash based on all these objects coming in. Quite a bit of code, pretty ugly, not the nicest thing you've ever seen, but ends up being, if I put this over here and put this over here, ends up creating this structure. This method ends up giving us the structure that we want with data pointing at the array, and then each of our objects kind of like being formatted with the ID, type, and attributes as also keys. So fast JSON API doing some nice stuff for you under the hood. All right, let's take the last 20 and kind of like work through the rest of the lesson plan. Let me pull it up. So I went through how to use the fast JSON API to do the index. I'd love for y'all to like do it for the show, check out the output, see the formatting in Postman, add the relationship, check out the formatting in Postman, add this custom attribute here, check out the formatting in Postman, so that you're getting familiar with like how the structure of the JSON object is changing based on you adding things to the serializer. And then see if you can do the same thing for books. So it'd basically be like, hey, build out the book serializer and add the relationship, a custom attribute, and its ID and name attributes. Or actually, there's a couple more. Add the ID, title, author, genre, summary, num sold. So add a couple more attributes. And remember, we gave those as arguments to our serializer generator when we did Rails G serializer store and then optional attributes. Okay, questions on what I'm asking you to go do? Okay, I'm going to open up these breakout rooms, and Gus, I'm going to read this message and come up with an answer for you, but I'll probably wait until the class is all back together. But I want to get y'all at least these last 20 minutes to work.